Like many woodworkers, one of my first projects was a workbench. I didn't know what I was doing then, not that I know now, but I went online and saw how this person built theirs and this person built theirs, and I combined those and made something that didn't work at all for me. After a few months, I learned what I should have built, so I took that thing apart and reused some of that wood to build a new bench. That's the one that you see me working on a lot, and it works well. It was really intended for power tools and rough work. So the surface is some really cheap plywood. I just screw things directly into it. It's got a power strip on the front, a cheap vise on the corner, and no way to really clamp anything down. So it works for what it is, and over time I've added some shelves and drawers to it. But now that I'm doing a lot of hand tool work, I really need a dedicated space for that. So there's a couple things that came to mind. One was I could take that thing apart and build something new, but I didn't really want to do that because it does have a lot of purposes. The other was that is actually a bit taller than I want, so I wanted to lower something down a bit for the hand tools. And the other part was just looking around my shop, my garage. I have this side, which is where my car is normally parked, and that side, which is where all the tools and benches and things get shoved. That meant I just had this one little tiny space over there that I thought I could use, which is where I'm storing my scrap wood. That would force me to clean up all that scrap wood and get rid of the bits that I wasn't ever going to use and figure out a better way of storing that stuff. So I based the dimensions of this on what would fit there, and now that it's built, I don't think I'll put it there. I'll figure out where it should go. But let's go ahead and build this. Started out by just grabbing a bunch of extra studs that I had and looking for which ones had the tightest ring so I could separate out those and use those as the top. Later on I realized I didn't have enough spares to really be that picky, but at least I started off with good intentions. Once I had a pile of the ones that I wanted to use, I could measure out the rough size that I wanted for the top and make a mark and then start sawing these down. Since this was going to be a hand tool bench, I thought it would be a good idea to actually use some hand tools to make it, though I did end up going back and forth with some others. Here you can see the studs that I've cut that have the much tighter rings. I decided to drill into my sawhorse so I could put a dog into it, and then I would use that to try to plane this. That didn't work great at first because the sawhorses aren't that stable, but eventually I kind of got into a good groove and I started to get some good shavings. When gluing this together, I used an excessive amount of glue, and then I would just rub the piece back and forth on the previous piece so that the glue would have a good spread. And once they were all in place, I could start clamping them down and looking for that squeeze out to come all the way through. I used a lot more glue than necessary, so I tried to wipe off some of the excess before I started putting more clamps on the other side. Once that dried up, then I could take this giant solid chunk over to my current workbench and try to clean up some of it. The goal wasn't really to get this perfect, it was basically just to get this good enough so that it was more or less flat so that I could take it to my planer and let that do all the work. I also took each individual chunk like this over to my mini jointer and used that to square up the sides. And then with the little tiny square, I checked to make sure it was good so that they would all line up, and that would save me some planing in the long run. I drew some lines across each of the pieces that would be where I'd put some dowels, and those were basically just going to be there to help line everything up. They don't provide any structural support really, but they do make it a lot easier to line things up, which helps with the planing again. And then it was back to putting a lot of glue on it, putting the dowels in, and squishing the pieces together. I used a scrap of wood with my mallet to try to hammer things into place before squeezing it all the way together with the clamps. Once that was all dry, I could take this giant chunk back over to my workbench and start cleaning it up. It was a bit heavy at this point and kind of an awkward size, but luckily there was enough room after I moved things around a little bit. I used my old crappy chisels to clean up some of the glue before I took my plane to it and started smoothing things out. Since this is all just stud grade pine, it's not only cheap, but that means it's really easy to plane. And then I could take my plane on its side and see any high spots. I ended up planing quite a bit, but it was actually a little bit fun, almost meditative in a way, I guess. But once the planing was done, then I used a card scraper to clean up the top a little more. Really, this doesn't have to be perfect because it's going to be a workbench and it's going to get dented and dinged, but I wanted to at least start it off reasonably well and feeling smooth. I got away from my hand tools and used my miter saw to cut all the pieces for the legs. I ended up digging through all my scraps because I have a whole lot of 2x4s that are in the 1 to 3 foot range, and so I found each of them that were long enough and cut pieces down that I needed. My goal was to try to use one long piece for each leg and then some scraps to reinforce it that would effectively make the joint. So that'll be more obvious in a little bit, but I went ahead and cleaned up the edge of pretty much every 2x4 scrap that I had, just because I wasn't sure how many I would use, and I knew eventually whatever project I did in the future I'd want squared up 2x4s anyway. So here I'm cutting what's going to be on the foot of the leg. Once I got down to this last little one, I didn't want my fingers that close to the saw blade. When I was cutting the longer pieces for the legs, I had to kind of reverse my position, so the scrap is on the right and the real piece is on the left. Then I was gluing the little foot piece in place, so the longer piece that's on the bench is the main leg, and then this little foot piece gets glued on. I used a square to make sure it was lined up because this would essentially create the bottom part of the tenon, so it needed to be very square so that it would line up with the other leg. And then I screwed it in place just so that I could take my clamps away and keep working on the next piece. With the lower piece in place, I flipped the leg around and started to glue the top piece in place. So you can see here I'm using this little spacer to basically create the space for the tenon, and I use that as just one of the offcuts from earlier, and I just sanded it down to make it just a little bit thinner than the other boards. I used a clamp to make sure the two leg boards were lined up, and then I put screws in at a bit of an angle so that it would kind of pull the board towards that tenon. So I'm effectively creating a tenon on the bottom part, which is on your left, and this cutout that's on the right is what's going to actually fit through the top of the bench. I needed to take my circular saw to the top to even out the edges, and it didn't quite go all the way through because this is maybe 3.5 inches thick and the blade goes 3-ish inches down. So I cut most of the way through and then just used a hand saw to finish it off. Once the legs were dried up, I just pulled the screws out. Most of them came out okay, so I can reuse them. A few broke off, but that's fine. And then I realized that the legs, somehow I measured things wrong and they weren't long enough. That tenon wasn't long enough to actually fit all the way through. So I took them over to the table saw and sort of elongated those tenons. The whole point of me doing that screwy glue up with 3 pieces per leg was to avoid trying to do this, but I guess I messed it up somehow anyway. Then I just used a chisel real quickly to clean up the edge so that this would sit flush against the bottom of the workbench top. And then I started laying out my marks for where I was going to chisel through to create the mortise on the top. I used the thickness of the leg to actually mark out the far edge, and then I used the thinner part to mark how far in to come. I think if the workbench were a bit wider, it would be good to come in a bit further than that, but I wanted to give this as wide of a stance as I could, considering that it wasn't all that wide to begin with. Once I had all my marks made, I was sure to scribble through the part that I wanted to chisel so I wouldn't make any mistakes. And then I used a Forstner bit to get partway through to just sort of give myself a head start, I guess. The Forstner bit wasn't long enough to actually get all the way through this, but it took out a decent chunk. So then I could start chiseling away. Since this is pine, the chisel work was really easy. And I just slowly worked at making that hole larger and larger, trying to stay inside of my lines so that I could eventually work my way out to them. Unfortunately, I got a little carried away and broke all the way through. I didn't think I was that close to the bottom, but I guess I should have been paying more attention. My goal was basically to chisel 3/4 of the way through and then flip it around and chisel the rest of the way through, but I screwed that up, and so I tried to glue it back together. Most of the time when pieces break like this, since they have such a weird shape, you can glue them and clamp them back into place, and it ends up turning out just fine. For whatever reason, this just didn't want to cooperate. I fussed with it quite a bit and used quite a bit of glue and clamps and everything, and just eventually it just didn't hold that well. With those clamps in place, I could go around to each of the other tenons I needed to work and get them roughly to the right size and then start to finesse them. Here you can see me actually correctly going from the other side, and my sawhorses aren't that stable, but you can see I worked 3/4 of the way through from one side and then came in from the other side, and then I can just clean up the hole and get nice walls all the way through. And it's just a matter of fitting and refitting the legs until the fit is really good. Sometimes it takes a bit of coercion. Once the legs were in place, I could put glue there and then start working on the cross supports. I kind of hammered them in by hand, and then I used some clamps to actually get them all the way in place. Then I just glued 2 more to the sides. This turned out to be a big mistake, which I'll show later, but once everything was dry, then I was able to pull it off of the sawhorses with a little bit of difficulty. But eventually I got it down, and then I could flip it over and take a look. It was looking good, so I needed to take the top off because I would need to glue it. This proved to be more challenging than I thought, and I broke my mallet handle, so I'll have to make a new one of those eventually. So I flipped a couple of my clamps around to make them spreaders to pull it apart, and I broke off one of the supports. So I took off the other one also and used some clamps to line everything up, and then just used glue and screws to force these back into place. I should have used screws in the first place, but I didn't think it was necessary, and I was clearly wrong. I used a small plane for the edges of the legs so that they wouldn't splinter, and then I could use a low angle plane to actually smooth out the legs. Then it was time to come back to the top where I had tried to glue the piece in place for where I broke through. Since that glue never set well, I just pulled that piece off and sawed away and chiseled to give myself a nice flat surface to work with. And then I could just glue a piece of scrap into place and hope that that would be reasonable. Once that glue was dry, I could take off the clamp and put the top in its place on top of the legs. I put a bunch of glue all the way down in from the top and let it run down so that this would be a nice solid joint. and then it was a matter of pushing the top all the way down. I didn't want to break another mallet, so I decided to just try to climb up on top of it and see what I could do from up there. That seemed to work okay, but I probably wouldn't recommend this method. Maybe clamps and a fresh mallet would be better. Once that was in place, I could take some of those scraps from the 2x4s over to my sander to create little wedges, and I just took an axe to them to kind of break off each of the wedges. This was a lot quicker than setting up any tools or sawing through them or whatever. So once I had each wedge ready, I could just put it in place in the tenons and just tap it all the way down in for a good joint. While that was drying, I thought I could put a shelf on the bottom of the bench. So I went and found a scrap piece of plywood. This was actually a piece that I had up on my wall with tools pushed against it with various bits of wood sticking out. So I took one of my cheap chisels to it to break off some of those pieces because I knew it had either some nails or brads or something in it. But once that was fine, I got it in place and just used a couple of screws on each side to put it down. This doesn't need to look pretty or really hold all that well. It's just one more flat surface in the shop. And I found my flush cut saw and used that to cut off the tenons and the little wedges that I had put in there. And this actually made pretty quick work of the pine, so it turned out well. Once I was cut all the way through, then I could bring over the plane and finally smooth it all the way. I used the block plane to ease over all the edges so I wouldn't have a sharp corner, and that turned out really nice. For the finish, I decided to use some old Danish oil. It was quite challenging to open. I don't know about you, but these types of cans always get stuck for me, so I used vice grips to pull it open. Then I just poured a bunch on the workbench and used the sock to spread it around. This has kind of a bit of a cherry color to it, so it livened up this pine a little bit. I am really excited to have this bench done. I've needed a good dedicated space for working with hand tools for a while. I actually started gluing up the top months ago, and so you've probably noticed, or maybe noticed in the background of some of my videos, the laminated boards sitting around in the background waiting for me to get back to them. But now it's done, I'm ready to use it, but there are a few things I kind of made note of as I was working on it that I wanted to talk about. So the first was my choice of height. When I'm planing things, I can put my weight into them instead of trying to plane up here or something, and that makes it a lot easier to plane. And the second benefit of that is the vise that I have. So this vise basically just sits on a bench and you clamp both sides, but now you can pinch the wood or your fingers in here and work on dovetails. Since it sits flush with the edge, the board can go all the way down and you can have however much showing that you want. And that's actually right in line with how I'll be sawing. So it puts things at the right height, and that works really well, or I hope it will. But the side supports underneath, when I put them on, I didn't have a plan for the plywood on the bottom, and so I was just putting them on the outsides. That means they're in line with the top edge, which doesn't really have any specific benefit for the way I'll use them other than just aesthetics. But if I were doing it again, I would go ahead and put them on the inside so that they can work as walls for that plywood piece and help keep whatever I put down there in place. But that's just a minor thing. A couple more things about this bench. So I originally intended this space to be where I've got all my scraps. It's not going to go there now, but that means I need to think about what will go out here. My first bench I ever made was probably this deep, and I didn't like that, but I made this one this deep because the idea was I could have a cabinet or something coming up there, And that would also serve to prevent tools from rolling all the way back. So I may end up carving a little channel in there or something to catch tools. Haven't decided yet. And another modification I'll probably make is to put some holes for dog holes and holdfasts. I don't know exactly where I will use them, so I'm waiting until the first time I need them to actually put the holes through. But overall, this turned out great. I'm excited to have this dedicated space, and now I just need to figure out where I'm going to put it.